Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah.
My name is Mujib.
And welcome to another episode of Let's Get To It. This is episode 26. And talking about my generation.
You're so
Do
cool.
some generational speak today. Yeah, I'm stoked for today.
Right. As soon as we got on to the conversation, I realized that you were so stoked about it, and I'm excited to see everything that you dove into, because I didn't dive into it as much as once we started talking about it last time. So I was like, okay, that's a cool idea. And then today I was wondering, like, okay, how's this conversation really going to go? Because it could go so many different ways. And then to jump online with you and have you say, like, oh no, I've really been thinking about it. So I'm excited to jump into that.
I have been thinking about it, just to let our listeners and now viewers know kind of how this podcast works in general. Is it's pretty organic, and basically we don't do a lot of prep and pre-planning beforehand, and usually it's a couple of days before that we kind of land on a topic, and yeah, it's pretty organic that way. So either Mujib has something on his mind and we'll go in that direction, or I have something on my mind, and that's kind of how it works. And so I approached him with this idea of talking about our generation. And what is that? We are millennials. Which I'm like, what? We are? Otherwise known as Gen Y. And I just thought it'd be really interesting to explore what that means. And Mujib and I were born pretty much 1 year apart, but we're both 1983 babies. It's just he was born at the beginning of 83 and I was born at the very end of 83. So yeah, I think we can speak to our own personal experiences, of course, through some of our life milestones, and maybe extrapolate that too, like in terms of this generation that, I don't know, like millennials are super highly criticized, and it's just really interesting. And even if we feel comfortable with that label, how we feel about it, do we feel some connection to Gen Xers? Do we feel any connection to Gen Z? Like where do we fit in? So I just thought it'd be a fun conversation.
Yeah, I as you started mentioning the dates at which they start to delineate those generations, I was thinking about how much I kind of associate the age at which folks are growing up more than the age at which they were born. So like, you said that a millennial might go to 1996.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, I wouldn't have thought that, because I think about somebody as being born in 96 interacting so much with, like, 2006 as they come of age at 10 years old. And so by 2016, the way that they're thinking is a little bit different than I would think somebody who's born in my generation is, you know what I mean? Just in that simple sense. So yeah, it'll be because so much of that is basically how I interact with the whole idea around generation, is that growing up, I really only thought about it in terms of like my grandmother, my mother, us as kids. Yeah. My sister, she's oldest sister. She's born in 1977. My brother's born in 1980. So, my brother's kind of the cusp of the generations as well. Yep. And I think because of that, we all just interacted as if we were the same generation anyway. So I'm influenced by a lot of what was in my house or what my siblings had access to before I had access to it. And when I think about like somebody who was born in 1990, for instance, I don't really see them as being influenced by like the 80s too much, because by the time they are even making sense of the world, it's already 2000. And so, right. I wonder about that sort of, so I'm interested to see what you have in mind when it comes to the generations themselves.
Yeah, it is really strange. I've looked into some stuff which really it takes some care to separate millennials and particularly to Y.1 and Y.2, and I think part of that is because we were born in the early 80s. We can remember like dialing a phone. Like, I had a rotary phone in my house. I don't know if you had a rotary phone, but it was like literally.
Yeah, for a little while.
You know, it wasn't, we are sort of bridged this technology gap. Like, so much was happening as we were coming of age, like when, you know, the internet was really introduced, and kind of figuring that out for the first time. And so it's just really interesting if, you know, being on this weird generational cusp and like having this memory. Like, I know when I was coming up, you know, if I wanted to go out with a boy, like I had to call the landline, I had to call the house phone, and likely talk to a gatekeeper, which was a parent. And, you know, hi, Mrs. So-and-so, can I speak to Daniel? You know, it's, I can't imagine not having that experience. Like today, you know, you can just like sext with somebody, and I'm you know, we're not that old, but it just kind of like blows my mind, sort of the access that people have to each other because of technology. But I wouldn't trade it for the world. Like I mean, I remember going to girlfriends' houses for sleepovers, and, you know, we'd all have like the phone, and, you know, just kind of the fun of like calling someone's house, especially when it came to boys, like, you know, calling a boy's house that you were into. Just all of those moments of adolescence.
Wow, yeah. Which,
like, you know, getting the butterflies, you know, of just talking on the phone, or, you know, your parents screening your calls. And I don't know, I wouldn't ever not want to have experienced that.
Wow, yeah, I hear that.
Do you remember that?
I'm remembering those things as you're talking about them, you know, like I think that when we've mentioned this idea in the past, I've definitely thought about phones, particularly like that's kind of how we engaged around it. You know, very much in the way that you just opened the conversation. So again, I'm excited about where it's going to go. But, you know, I think about that technology itself, the phone, but then like you just described all of the other instances that go around it, and not having any interaction with that as a technology takes an entire kind of experience out of somebody's reality who wasn't born into that. And I'm still kind of at the mentality where I think about that person being so young anyway.
Right.
Like I'm like, oh, that's such a young person who never had to deal with that tech. But in reality, that person is between 15 and 20 years old now. You know what I mean? And like those kids never dealt with, you know, no, I can't say never, because it's also, there's the interesting reality around where you grew up and how you grew up and what you had access to too, because like, you know, whereas we didn't really have access to cellular phones until we were like late teens, you know, I had friends who had cell phones earlier than that, so on and so forth. And I bet you some people still have weird little dial-up phones just based on their experience with a grandmother or something like that, or like people that are dealing with those old technologies. And so again, how an older generation can then influence how somebody's interacting with their surroundings and with what they're dealing with. I was thinking about like the way that people approach the utilities and things like that, you know, and that concept of like, you know, these prepaid minutes, almost like everything seemed so much like you're making collect calls and you're doing all these things in which like the clock is ticking, like the electric bill is running every single second. And you spoke about that yourself, like with growing up and being like somebody was always like turning the lights off and telling you like how much power we were using and all these different things, and how, you know, obviously that's still a thing, like don't just leave your lights on, but at the same time, like we're not dealing with the same like coming out of the 1980s where every single car weighed 4 tons and gasoline was like sprouting out of every single orifice that somebody had, you know, like people were just like wasting resources to the extent that like nothing was efficient, nothing was, you know, your refrigerator was like, don't leave the door open, you're gonna destroy the house, you know.
Right.
Fridges are more efficient than that now. Like if you leave the door open, it will beep at you, or like, you know,
it'll talk to you.
The light will turn off and you'll notice, oh, the light turned off, I'll close it. Whereas like, you know, me, I grew up with a mother and a fridge and a grandmother who grew up with a Frigidaire icebox, you know what I mean? And so like my interaction with the technology, even as simple as a refrigerator, is different than somebody who was born again in 2000, where
Yeah.
where you know, you're at that point looking at LG fridges starting to come out and things like that, and that's like, there was an LG 5 years before that. They didn't exist as like a big like technological company or technology, I guess.
It's definitely interesting. I just find what's so interesting about folks' position kind of in the birth in the early 80s is just this, again, that thinking about bridging these gaps, like, and how I sort of define my own coming of age. And another way for that is, again, I kind of think of it in terms of like dating relationships and things, but like, making a CD for somebody. Things like that. And maybe now it's the equivalent is maybe like, oh, I made you a Spotify playlist, which like takes 3 seconds. I don't know.
Right. Like, I don't yet. Would you even
there's
do
something
that for
about, I don't know. Like there's something about, either if you'd made a tape or a CD, like it took a certain amount of effort, like a lot, to do some of these things. I don't know. I just kind of
everything did in that way.
Yeah.
Like, you had to write letters to people and stuff like that. Like you know, I think about that a lot in terms of how we do business and how easy it is to connect with people. Like this is futuristic, really, and only in an imagination 50 years ago. And like I'm saying, like I'm influenced by people who were living 50 years ago.
Right.
So to me, being born in the 80s, born in 83, again, it's like a real serious bridge because I'm influenced by people for whom this was science fiction, and I'm influencing people for whom I've always known this was coming.
Right.
Because we were born when we were born, and with a certain awareness for like what was on the way, I guess.
And what's interesting, and I don't know who out there decides what these cutoffs are for generations. Like I don't know who's making these decisions. Right. But I would think that because technology is progressing so exponentially, that you almost have to shorten the time frame. Otherwise, because like having these 20-year time spans almost is like too big. Right. Because even within, again, speaking about our own generation, Gen Y or millennials, I don't necessarily feel like I have a ton in common with a 25-year-old. I have some things in common with 25-year-olds, don't get me wrong. But as a 37-year-old with some of the, again, sort of the experiences I had growing up, the things I had access to or didn't have access to and how things were changing is very different. So, kind of as I was looking at this sheet, this breakdown, I'm like, whoever's responsible for making these decisions, I think needs to tighten up like the time frame because things are changing so rapidly that you start to feel a little bit more disconnected even by decade. And obviously these time frames span longer than a single decade. Right. So that's kind of interesting for me too, because just things are happening so quickly, technologically speaking. And I'm not a technophobe. Like I don't want people to think that I'm anti-technology or otherwise. It's just, I think you are certainly, every single person has something that they have some kind of nostalgia for, especially when it comes from your childhood or your adolescence or your coming of age, Right. That's so important to each one of us.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I think about like who do I know that was born in '97 that I've interacted with on like on an intimate level. Like who do I know who was born in 2000? That's like who are the 21-year-olds that I know right now, and like what influence do they have on me? Like it's wild that you say what you just said as far as like the way that you can choose to go, because for me, I feel like a lot of my revitalization as an individual came from engaging with people who were on the younger end of my spectrum of generation. You know what I mean? Like I started hanging out with more kids that were born in the 90s and late 90s, mid 90s, I guess, like 90 between 90 and 96, you know.
Yeah.
And if we look at like a lot of the influence on the music that we talk about now, a lot of those folks were born in the 90s at this point. You know, like you see people that are making a major shift in culture that were born in 1996, you know what I mean?
Right.
And they have
Or
access to that there's a certain level of freedom that came with generation, what'd you call it, Generation Z, you know, because if we're Generation Y, then there's a certain level of freedom that comes with Generation Z, like the South American apartheid is over, right? So you have the Berlin Wall is gone, you know, so you have these remnants of this violent culture that, you know, they kind of can smell the smoke of, but they don't really know that so much, you know what I mean? And like for us, because I was thinking about this reality about our generation, is like we're the generation where like No Means No came out on television. Before that, everybody was getting their ass slapped and women were getting raped constantly on TV. And like, so that's like, we grew up with this certain level of atrocity left over from the previous generation, you know, and we talk about heavy stuff like that from time to time, as far as like the way that the world really was in the 60s and what people were fighting so hard for in the 60s into the 70s, and, you know, what people were fighting, what fighting against progression looked like in the 80s, you know what I mean? What progression looks like in 2021 is a long, hard fight, you know, a long fought win. Like all these wins that we're having right now progressively are like majorly hard, long fought wins, you know. And we are a cusp generation, you know, like we were born in 83. AIDS was like new. Like it was like a thing on TV that they were like AIDS, and it's not that it was new, but it was so big now it's in the mainstream. You know, so like we grew up with that stuff on TV, or this is your brain on drugs.
I was gonna say the DARE
you know
programs.
I mean? Yeah, DARE programs,
in schools.
Exactly, things like that. So you had like, you know, we grew up on after school specials. When you talk about that, you know, there wasn't like a Lifetime channel. There were like 6 TV channels. And one of them saw a point to put on at 3:00 in the afternoon when we got home from school. You can get too drunk, or you can fuck your life up. You know what I mean? And like our parents' generation were drinking fucking whiskey or beer or whatever they were doing. Like their parents were drinking all the time, all day long. Like that was like the only thing you saw was like drink and smoking. And like we're gonna supply you with these different ways. So like, I don't know. I don't want to get too hard into that, because this generation is definitely heavy on drugs and drink and everything like that is even to the max more than it was then, because you have everything that they had then, plus all the shit that younger generation after generation continue to come up with. So you have like now this idea of being turned, whereas then the idea of being turned was just like, I don't know, a lot of cocaine or something. I don't know what people did to like really go super wild back then.
The Four Loko just came to mind, but
I'm not talking about our generation. I'm talking about like the previous generation, because I'm wondering like how as an adult, like what was the mentality of a 36-year-old mainstream person, the previous generation from me? You know what I mean? Not just like my sister, the previous generation, but like the beginning of my sister's generation, like that person who was 36 years old, like the parents that were giving birth to Generation X, you know,
the
what
boomers.
Was influencing them,
right? Would those be the boomers?
The boomers, exactly.
And the boomers are also our parents too.
Yeah, my father's a baby boomer for sure. I don't think my mother is. She was born in 55.
Well, let me see. I have a handy dandy worksheet
awesome.
here.
That's awesome.
Technically, the baby boomer generation spans from 1946 to 1964.
Oh, that's crazy.
So yeah, that's what I mean. Like these, they're a couple of decades, and if we just think about, you know, that's a lot of time, right?
You know what it is? Time does this donut thing where instances happen and generations speed forward in the way that we interact with the world as individuals. So like you mentioned 9/11. I think about 64, like you know, the fact that the baby boomers lived long enough to start getting drafted, like that generation was long enough that like the ones who started that generation born as like the children of war heroes turned war heroes wherever they were fighting from all over the world. But they lived long enough to start a whole nother war where people were just getting kill. And then if that generation starts in the 60s, that's where Generation X starts. It's like 65,
it's, you know, so generation, it's totally blowing my mind. It's wild. So technically Generation X is between 65 and 80.
Right. So Generation X, they're born in segregation.
Yes.
That's still U.S. segregation. That's still Jim Crow lynching remnants law. That's black people trying to fight for like the right to have a house without getting firebombed.
Absolutely.
In a new territory, just about. You know what I mean? Like.
Well, and also, and to that point, it really puts in perspective, like how far we haven't come when we try to really remove ourselves. Like, oh, things were so long ago.
Right.
No, they weren't.
No,
they weren't. And you know, again, we have brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, mothers, fathers, grandparents that are still living.
Right.
That have I just have to say too, whatever this document that I was looking at, it began with what is called the silent generation, and I have no idea where that name comes from. So if people want to send us fan mail and let us know. But the silent generation, 1928 to 1945, I just have to put out there that my grandmother is about to turn 104. She's still alive, bless her soul. She's not even included. She's a decade older than the silent generation, so I don't even know what she's part of.
Do they have a generational name for her? Huh?
I don't. I gotta look that up.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But again, we have people walking this earth. I think the point is that I think to make ourselves feel better, or at least, I'm only speaking from a cis white female perspective right now. I think to make ourselves feel better, we try to push a lot of things off. Like, it happened so long ago. We have moved so far. We have made so much progress. Look at all of the things that we've done. It doesn't, look at your own family. You know, who's still alive? What was their childhood like? What was, no, we haven't.
Right. No, not
we
at all.
really haven't. And especially, it's really interesting for me to just kind of see these groupings and these numbers kind of on paper and really like speaking loudly. And, I have a brother in the Gen X category. He's a 1972 baby, and he's got 3 kids of his own grown, or one is in his 20s, which I'm like, how did that happen?
Right.
And so it's just, I don't know. My head just kind of pops off when you really start to kind of think about, right now, if I don't have any children, let's say if I decide to have a child, these cousins are going to be 20 plus years apart in age. Wow. A lot of shit went down.
Right.
It's just interesting how they're, how they're going to relate. Especially again, sort of at the speed of sort of these technological changes, where I even find myself like TikTok, I don't know how to do that. And again, I'm not that old and I'm not that incompetent, but it is just, it's pretty incredible, know?
Well, that's what I mean too, is like being where we are on the cusp is the reality that you still have the generational experience to look it up. Like if you want to know what TikTok is, we could figure it out by the end of the conversation and throw up our first TikTok, and see
Coming
what we
soon.
do with it, because it's like everything is still at our fingertips if we engage again with the younger end of our spectrum. This person must have been born in like 92, and it was their little brother, so he must have probably been born in like 96, 97, And we were in Cali and San Diego, and we're sitting out back of this person's house, and we're trying to figure out how to put the castanets on our fingers, and like like it's like an authentic pair of castanets, you know? And so I'm like figuring out what's the best finger to put it on, so on and so forth. And this younger brother comes around the corner and he's like, what are y'all doing? And I was like, you know what, I'm trying to figure out these castanets, like exactly how to play them. And he pulls out his phone and he's like scrolling and he, boom, just puts them on his fingers. Yeah, you got a phone, you know? It's like just like that vibe to me. And I was living here at the time, like East Calais, and this was in 2016 maybe. So even that much farther back with like East Calais cell phone technology 5 years ago is probably not what it is now still. And so like I wasn't used to using my phone for random shit like that. Like, you know, I'm more of a computer generation, like a laptop, you know, like if I was still like interacting with most of my media through my laptop, like not even really interacting with my media through my phone, because the majority of my phone time existence, I didn't have any type of media to interact with on it. My phone screen was this big or whatever. And like, what video am I really going to watch on it? And how much am I going to YouTube? If I YouTube something, I'm going to open my laptop and YouTube it. But like this generation, us now is like, why would I open my laptop to go onto YouTube? I could YouTube while we're having this conversation, and then I'm here and talking to you and telling you how to do it now. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so in that moment, that kid really made me realize that. You know what I mean? And I was like, oh damn, like you're right. Like you have a cracked screen phone. I have a new phone in my pocket, like a new smartphone. I could have taken that out. How do I use the castanets? Like I use a laptop. I know enough to know that I can do that. I have the app on my phone, but I don't have the length of interaction and time with it that I know that that's in my pocket to do that until that kid pulls it out. Now, later on that trip, we're riding our bike through some neighborhoods coming down, and we kind of end up getting up in the hills, and we're trying to figure out like how do we get back down to the coast. And there was some workers working, and you know, we stop and ask like a worker, like a contractor, hey, how do you get back down to the highway or whatever? And he's like, oh, you got your phone? And I was like, yeah, I got my phone. I give him my phone, and he's like,
oh, it's here. An address?
And I'm just like, I have it in my pocket. Like I have the map in my pocket. All I did was pull the map out of my pocket and give it to you. And you have the map in your pocket.
But again, dude. You know what? Again, that makes me think of, you know, when I was in college, I was printing out MapQuest directions.
Exactly. So that's my whole point. Is like I remember going to see like College Girlfriend with like MapQuest written on the
printed
back,
out,
and like my specific thought directions on the back of the picture of the map. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But this dude was in his 50s.
Yeah.
The second guy was in his 50s. Now, because he lives in a place where maybe he has some kids, maybe he's interacting enough, like his place is fast paced enough that the technology that he's interacting with entails the fact that he's got a smartphone in his pocket for a reason. Like they made the smartphones for a reason, and maybe his life just calls on existing with it. Whereas like even 5 years previous to that, as a contractor, my phone was like a chirp phone, you know, like one of the Nextels that you press the button on.
Oh yeah.
Know? Or like you remember when I watched The Matrix at some point not too long ago, and remember when that sliding phone was like a brand new technology. Those flip phones were like small phones, and Blackberries and stuff were such brand new technology that.
Oh my God, I had a Blackberry.
Did you? You see that there again, my sister had a Blackberry, but I didn't. I was born too late. I wasn't influenced enough. So for you, it's interesting to hear us talk about this conversation too, because for you lean a lot closer towards the older end of our spectrum.
Yeah.
Whereas like there was a point in time when I decided like the older end of our spectrum is not as turnt as like the younger end of our spectrum, and I started leaning that way. And you know, like not just turnt in the sense of, well, the reason why kids are so much more turnt is because they have the freedom.
Yeah.
You know, like people aren't just smashed up for being fun, you know what I mean? Whatever.
Right.
And so many fun things were so damped. And then the next generation kind of took them a while to realize it. Like I think about the things that my parents learned from me. Like my father was a pretty hip dude, but it's because he had interaction with his wife's grandchildren, and they, you know what I mean? So like he had interaction with them from when they were born in the 80s to the 2000s and, you know, watch them with their technology, watch them take what they could take and do what they did with it. So again, I think it's, if we can look at where we interact, then we can really kind of like weave these generations together. And this is all coming from two people who also didn't grow up in a household with like great grandparent, parent,
Right.
and child, where people just have an unbroken understanding of what's going on, place and time, because they grew up with those stories of their folks telling them this is where you are in time. Like, you're not trying to figure it out.
You said something really interesting kind of during at the beginning of the conversation too, in terms of siblings and who influences your household in general. And you know, my brother is 12 years older than I am, and I was heavily influenced by him, especially musically. I idolized him, you know, as a 10-year-old. He was in college, and so he would come home from college, and like he went to college in Boston, and he was just really into house music and techno, and so he would bring that home. And it's just kind of funny when I think about what I listen to and what I love to play in my spin classes and things like that. They are completely, that part of my music taste is so heavily influenced by my brother, and I just get so lit up. But it was because he would come home, and I just thought, like, my brother is so cool. Like, he's going to clubs, and this is what he's dancing to, and this is the scene. And, you know, I just wanted to be like him. So I was like, all right, I got to listen to, you know, CNC Music Factory and Black Box and like, and Snap and all that stuff, and like getting down to it. So it's really funny how our siblings can just kind of rub off on us for what, you know, all kinds of reasons. And I think about, so I